I'll be honest and I'll admit that my approach to social network analysis might be deemed by some people to be a little bit quirky. So we decided to also include in this series an interview with Nick Crossley, who takes what might be considered a slightly more conventional approach to network analysis. One thing that he does, however, which so far as I know very few other social network analysts do, is to actually construct his networks from archival and historical data. So in this interview we'll explore the data he's used, how he's used that data to convert it into network matrices, and what he finds out about covert networks, drawing on the case study of the suffragette movement.
So we're here today with Nick Crossley, Professor of Sociology at the University of Manchester, and we're going to talk about his article on suffragette networks. And just as an introductory question, can you just give us a short summary of your study and the method you used?
Yes, so the study was looking at the networks of the suffragettes, and we were interested in the idea that that when networks have to be covert, that's to say when the connection between the people in the networks is meant to be secret in some way, or the activities of the members of the network are supposed to be secret in some way, that affects the structure of the network. But the different theoretical predictions of how it affects the structure of the network vary widely, and in some cases are directly juxtaposed to one another. So some people say that covert networks will be very sparse, other people say that they will be very dense. Some people say they'll be very centralised, other people say that they'll be very decentralised. So we were thrashing about, really trying to find a case study that we could use to test some of these ideas out. And then we discovered, one of my colleagues discovered in the British Library, a report that the Home Office had put together in the 1920s, I think, where they listed all of the court cases involving all of the suffragettes, and because they'd also put times and places and dates in that report, we were able to work out which suffragettes had been arrested together, and on that basis we were able to reconstruct their networks. And the other interesting thing was that this covered a period from 1906, I think, to 1914, which was a period over which the suffragettes had got progressively more militant. So in the very early stages, all that they were doing really was lobbying MPs and sending depositions to Parliament. By the end of the period, they were setting fire to buildings, bombing buildings, and so there was we expected that they would need to be more covert over that period of time, and in fact there is historical evidence to suggest that early on that the whole point was to get arrested. So they did what they did, they broke the law, and then they stood there and they waited for the police to come and arrest them, and that was part of the tactic. But by the end, they wanted to remain anonymous. They didn't want to be captured for what it was that they were doing. So we wanted to see whether the networks changed over that period of time.
So just briefly, could you explain what degree centralization means, please?
Okay, so degree centralization. So we need to begin with the idea then of degree centrality. So that's the idea that everybody in a network has a certain number of connections. So if I'm connected to 4 people in a network, I have a degree of 4, or a degree centrality of 4. What degree centralization is then is a measure of the dispersal of those scores. So basically it tells you whether all of the, or a high proportion of the connections within the network are centred on a small number of people, or whether the or whether the total connections in the network are more evenly distributed across everybody in the network. And the more evenly distributed they are, the less centralised, degree centralised the network is. The more centred and concentrated on a small number of people they are, the more degree centralised it is, the higher the degree centralisation.
On page 9, you constructed two-mode incidence matrix, and
Yeah.
could you just explain how that works and what part it is of your research?
Yeah. Okay. So so sometimes when you put a network matrix together, you have what's called an adjacency matrix, and that would be a matrix where along your first column you have the name of all of your different nodes, all the people in the network, and across the top row you have that same set of that same set of nodes, and you then indicate in the cells of the matrix which people are connected to which other people. In an incidence matrix, what you have are two different sets of nodes. So down your first column you have in our case you have the activists, so we have a list of all of the suffragettes who are listed in the Home Office report that I mentioned, and then across the top you have a list of all of the court cases again that are recorded in that report, and the cells within the matrix indicate which suffragettes were involved in which of the court cases. So that gives you, that's one way of representing a network that involves two different types of things. It involves activists and it involves events, and you can also visualise that as a network with two different types of node and connecting lines going from the activists to the events that they're involved in. What we did in that project though then was to decompose that network and to break it down into a network of activists where activists are linked to one another when they were tried at the same time. They were involved in the same court case.
You talk about localised clustering in a globally sparse network. Again, can you just explain what that means for us, please?
Right, yeah, okay, so as I said earlier, one of the questions, one of the debates in the literature about covert networks was how dense they are, and density is a measure of the proportion of the possible ties within the network that are actualised. So for X number of activists, there is a possible X number of ties, but in actual fact only a proportion of those possible ties will be realised, and that's a density score. And when we first started, we were trying to test these various ideas about density just by looking at that basic density, that basic density score. But it occurred to us in the process of doing that probably, even if density was important, even if it was important for activists to be involved in dense networks, that didn't mean that the whole network had to be dense. You would get the same effects, the same sort of value that people were talking about for density if it just was the case that activists were clumped in tight and dense clusters within the network. So it might be that only a very small proportion of the potential ties in the network overall are realised, but each activist is embedded in a small, very, very densely connected cluster. And so one measure of that we can use is what's called the clustering coefficient. And what the clustering coefficient does basically is for each node in the network, for each individual, it looks at who they're connected to, and then it looks at whether the people that they're connected to are connected to one another, and that's referred to as ego net density. And the clustering coefficient is then an average of all of those ego net densities. And so that tells you whether individuals are embedded in tightly knit clusters, even if overall the score for density for the network is, it suggests that it's very, very low.
Just a final question on definitions. Could you just briefly explain isolates, dyads, and what a transitivity coefficient is?
Right, okay, so isolates are nodes within the network who have no connection to anybody else. Dyads would be pairs of actors who are connected to one another but not connected to anybody else, and they're quite interesting in terms of the activism angle, because we find a lot more of those dyads towards the latter part of the period, suggesting that we have activists working together in very small teams, or in some cases just working as pairs, but apparently not having any connection to anybody else within the network, or at least not working at an operational level with anybody else in the network. And then the transitivity coefficient is a bit like the clustering coefficient that I've just referred to. So transitivity is the idea that if I, for example, know you, and you know Florence, that ought to mean that Florence and I know each other, or at least it ought to increase the likelihood that we will know each other. So what the transitivity measure is it takes every possible grouping of 3 people within the network, and it identifies the structure of connections between them, and it sort of says, well, you might expect lots of cases where 3 people, nobody knows anybody. You might expect cases where you've got dyads who are connected, but you wouldn't expect to find many cases where I know you and you know Florence, but we don't know each other, because that shouldn't happen according to ideas of transitivity. I mean, of course it does, but you ought to find disproportionately more completely connected triads.
So our research is mainly focused on methodology. We found that sometimes people will have a methodology and then try and kind of find a case to apply it to.
Yeah.
Sometimes it happens the other way around. So we were wondering, which way was it for you, and why social network analysis?
Right, and I've got to be honest. So,
we don't have to do this question.
No, I want to do it, but it's alright, I'm joking. So, in the long term, I would say that I looked to the method because of what I was interested in. And this is, I suppose, going a little bit broader than the Suffragettes paper itself. I had an interest in social movements, and I had an interest in what I call music worlds or music scenes. And it seemed to me that in both cases, if you wanted to explain why they happened, if you wanted to explain how they came about, then networks were absolutely crucial to that. You know, you read any sort of journalistic account of a music scene, and within its early chapters you always get an account of how so-and-so met so-and-so, and then they met somebody else, and you get a picture of a network that's starting to build, and then out of the network you get the music scene, or you get the social movement, or whatever else. So in that sense, I looked to social network analysis because that was the obvious method for capturing and analysing that phenomenon. But of course, once I got bitten by the bug of social network analysis, then I was interested in finding data that I could then use to further my interest in social networks. So it's a bit of both, really. And I think in the Suffragettes case, it came out of debates about the networks themselves. So there was no other method that you could use, but my interest in the questions was probably driven by my interest in the method.
Yeah. As you mentioned earlier, the suffragettes were a covered social movement. What effect does that have on your research, and is it not a bit of an impossible task to get the right covered social network?
Yes. I mean, I have. There's a few bits here. Yeah. Okay. So the thing, if you're looking at covert networks historically, that's a lot easier, because usually the necessity for them to remain covert is in the moment, and over time what was going on, what was happening that was covert, comes to light and is more easily accessible. So I think if you want to do this research historically, it's not quite as difficult as it sounds, because they're no longer covert. And similarly, a lot of the studies in the area, I suppose you could say, focus on failed covert operations, because they're covert operations that eventually people found out about. So there is that. But I mean, one of the struggles that I've found sometimes in the literature and in trying to talk about these matters with people is that people have assumed that data on covert networks is in some senses less reliable than data on other kinds of networks. And I'm really not sure about that. Unfortunately, it's for the reason that I think all data on networks is going to be problematic. It's always difficult to know whether you've really captured the ties that you were interested in, whether you've really fully captured the network that you were interested in. And I'm not sure that it's any more especially difficult for covert networks than for any other. And I suppose the final point on that would be that you just have to be absolutely clear about what you've got. I mean, we had this this comprehensive, or I mean, relatively comprehensive. I mean, we did find a few cases that the Home Office hadn't found, but relatively comprehensive document put together by the Home Office about suffragettes and court cases. And so we were aware that we couldn't talk about suffragettes who never got tried for anything. We couldn't talk about relationships that were independent of co-involvement in a particular action for which people got arrested. So we don't know which of the suffragettes were friends, we don't know which of the suffragettes took part in political activities that didn't directly lead to them becoming arrested. But I think as long as you're absolutely clear about what you've got and what you think what you've got can tell you, then I think it's a legitimate and interesting, useful exercise.
Yeah. We'd like to talk about figure 6, if that's okay. Basically, if you could just briefly explain it to us. And I think it talks about time, the fifth time slot that you did. Did you consider doing it from times 1 to 4 at all?
It's a pragmatic thing. This really just that I don't think the journal would have allowed or wanted us to have so many network diagrams in there. And also perhaps having all 6 would be a little bit overbearing. I mean, when I've presented this material in seminars and at conferences, I would typically have maybe 3 time points, because the contrast between the time points is quite striking. I mean, network analysis is often a visual method. It is often something that the graphs immediately tell you something. And if I had got an earlier time point, a graph from an earlier time point, I think it would be immediately striking, but I just had so many figures and tables in that paper that I thought it was pushing my luck a bit, and I probably should just go for the one that does show and illustrate the fragmentation of the network.
So would you mind just explaining to us what Figure 6 actually shows us?
Right.
What it means, please.
Okay. So so you understand that you've got little squares there, vertices, which represent suffragettes, and you've got connecting lines between them where they were co-arrested. What is interesting about that is that you can see all around the graph space disconnected clumps of suffragettes. So to go back to what we were saying about dyads, there are lots of dyads in there, lots of combinations of two suffragettes who are linked to one another but not linked to anybody else. Or you've got some 4s here, you've got some 3s, you've got a couple, 3 or 4 bigger components. So a network component is a cluster of nodes, all of whom are connected by a path. You've got a few of those, but you've got lots of apparently independent, lots of apparently independent and unconnected clumps. And if we had looked at the earlier time periods, you wouldn't have seen that. You would have seen that you could pretty much pick any node in the network and you would have been able to link it by a path to any other. Whereas here you just can't do that for many of the nodes in this network. And what the diagram shows is that they're only connected to one or two others, and that doesn't connect them back indirectly even to the rest.
Just to go briefly back to Figure 6.
Yeah, I can remember it. Okay.
Can you tell us what does the length between like two different points show us?
The length between 2 points has no meaning. Okay. Technically the length has no meaning. So technically social network analysis operates with a different conception of space. This was interesting really for us because there was a question of what exactly this demonstrated, because one thing would be that it would support one of the theories about covert networks, which is that because people want to avoid getting caught, they avoid making contacts with lots of other people, because every person that you form a contact with potentially makes you vulnerable, because if they get arrested they might inform on you. So the idea, one of the ideas is that you minimise your contact with other people because that will make you less vulnerable. But we also wondered whether, I mean, this was also a time when the suffragette leadership were at war with one another. It was a turbulent period in the organisation of the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, and so we also wondered whether it was just an indication that the whole thing was falling apart, and it might not have been to do with covertness at all. But obviously you can't really show that in the paper. All you can say is, well, it was fragmenting, and that is consistent with ideas about what ought to happen when networks get more covert. But as in any piece of research, it's always possible that it's happening for another reason, where the vertical and the horizontal axes are meaningful, and depending on how high up you are or how far to the left or right, that has significance. It's not like that. The conception of space within social network analysis is purely based on connections. So if I'm represented directly next to one other node and we have a connecting line, and I'm connected to somebody right on the other side of the graph and we have a connecting line, there's technically no difference between that. It doesn't mean anything. Having said that, the visualization algorithms that are used do tend to work on particular kinds of principles where they try to maximize or minimize certain kinds of things. And typically, for example, you will be put next to people who have a similar profile of ties to you. So So you can maybe as a starting point, you can infer that if I'm next to somebody, close to somebody on the graph, that means that there is some similarity in our network profile, but that's not technical, and really it's just an aesthetic matter. And of course, network analysts move things about. I mean, when I was doing that graph, the way it came out as the algorithm did it wasn't always neat and tidy, and I just moved things. I'll move this over here and I'll move that over there, just to try and perhaps, for example, to illustrate the fragmentation further. And that's not cheating. That's not sort of illegitimate because the placement of the nodes doesn't have any technical meaning.
That makes sense.
How are you mindful in your research of the turnover of records? People being imprisoned and so unavailable for further action, and new people joining the movement?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that was something that we struggled with. But in most cases, the sentences that the suffragettes got were fairly short. So they were often in prison for weeks, occasionally months, but not much more than that. So within the year time slots that we used, there shouldn't have been too much of an effect on that. But we were mindful, and to some extent, one of the things that we tried to look at was suffragettes coming back in the network later on. So whether there was a time period during which they weren't or hadn't been arrested, and then later on they came back. But the overwhelming thing that we found was that most suffragettes were only arrested on one occasion. So they did one illegal action, or got caught for one illegal action during that whole period of 9 years or so, and certainly none of them were imprisoned for anything like that period of time. So I think it is an issue. It would be more of an issue if their sentences were lengthy, but their sentences weren't lengthy, so it's perhaps not such an issue.
Is there a particular reason why no new recruits were found after 1913?
Well, in 1914, that of course was the start of the First World War, and the Pankhursts, who were the key figures in the Women's Social and Political Union, really suspended their suffragette activism and started to contribute to the war effort. So they, in fact, it was a very strange, but in terms of contemporary political orientations, it was a very strange turnabout, because it became quite a kind of strongly patriotic, nationalist sort of focus on the war effort. So they weren't there was no recruitment on that level because they weren't recruiting. There were other organisations which continued and existed over that period and on to the point of where the sort of suffrage was successful, but even those organisations, I think, largely suspended protest activity, and certainly illegal protest activity during the First World War.
So you mentioned right at the beginning that you found that record in the British Library about the sentence, and that was your data. But was there maybe another way of getting the data? Maybe names mentioned in newsletters, people being part of one network?
Yeah, we did a few different types of data gathering. So the reason that my colleague was in the British Library was that she was looking for diaries, because some of the suffragette diaries are in there, and on the basis of suffragette diaries we were able to reconstruct what we call the ego net of particular activists. So we were able to, just using that one activist as a centre point, we were able to snowball outwards and find all of their contacts. And we did about 4 or 5 ego nets where we just focused on a particular activist. We also, another colleague of mine, and this was a sort of peculiar circumstances to do with her dad, but we came across an archive of another suffragette, Helen Watts, and we had her personal correspondence, and we had her speeches, and a set of similar archival material to that. And again, we were able to reconstruct her ego net on the basis of on the basis of that. And we did actually. I'd started trying to put the bigger picture together by using the newspaper archives, and just because of course a lot of this stuff was covered in the newspapers, and the newspapers tended to report who was in court, you know, so you'd get a long list of naming and shaming, we'll all be in court today for blah blah blah. And I'd started that, but then when we found the Home Office directory, it was simple, what was the point? That's the most reliable. So it's, yeah.
So your case study used the suffragettes. Is there any comparison between the effects of secrecy on them and the effects of secrecy on today's social movement networks?
Well, yeah, I'm involved actually currently in a project looking at covert networks as a whole, more generally, with other colleagues here at Manchester. And what we've done so far is to compile an archive of data from people who claim to have studied covert networks. I think we've got something like 100 or so different, and some of them are contemporary, because of course a lot of the interest in covert networks has been inspired by 9/11 and the whole kind of the whole sort of Al Qaeda and ISIS types of things since then, and so there are a few network data sets that purport to be about that, and also with one of my PhD students who I worked with on the Suffragettes project, but we've also done some stuff on the IRA, which is obviously a bit more recent than that, looking at, again, mainly looking at published sources that we've been able to find for them. The difficulty is really in how you specify the network. Like I was saying earlier, you know, we were quite clear in the suffragette stuff that we knew who had been arrested together, and that's all we know, and that's what we're working from. And when we look through our archive, there are so many different kinds of ways in which networks can be configured, and of course, in most cases, people are just relying upon newspaper accounts of the 9/11 bombers or whatever. And but yeah, I mean, the ideas ought to apply. The ideas are, there's no real. I mean, the technology's changed, and I suppose that's a different dynamic there, because people have different ways of interacting, and that might impact upon the network in various ways. But the short answer is we're trying to test it, we're trying to have a look at that kind of thing, but we do come up against the fact that every data set makes different assumptions about networks and gathers data in different ways, and that does make the comparability very difficult. But I think the basic ideas presumably hold, as well as hypotheses.
Yeah, then just as a final question, if you were to do the research again, would you change anything? Was there something that later on you regretted doing?
The way we did it was very limited by the data that we had. So, I mean, there's always a kind of, in an ideal world, we would know this or we would know that. I think probably much of what we did, much of the way in which we did what we did was just constrained by the data that we had, and that's one of the things about archival research. I really enjoy working with archival research. I really enjoy sort of historical, sociological types of inquiry. And I suppose one of the reasons for that is that the constraints are there. You can't go back and ask the suffragettes, they're all gone, and You know, you can. There are other sources that you can look to, but that's your data. That's what you've found, and that's what you can work with. I suppose. So in that sense, well, we couldn't change it. We could only really do what we did because that's all we had. But I mean, I think that there are always further analytic, given the data that you've got, once you've got the data, there are different analytic strategies that you can try, different ways of working with the data, and perhaps challenging and questioning some of your own assumptions. I mean, I guess that's work still to be done. I think that what we did had to be done as a first step. It was the kind of obvious thing to do with what we had, and I don't think that you can move on to do less obvious and more critical and questioning things with it until you've got the basic building blocks in place. So I suppose that's a kind of a, well, no, I'm glad we did it the way that we did it, but I don't think that by any means the way that we did it is the only way you could do it, and it would be interesting to explore it in different ways and see what else comes out.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
Okay, right, thank you.
One of my favourite things about this interview with Nick Crossley is that, without him knowing that this is something I said during the series as well, he also reiterated this point that it's okay to be methods driven. He's a big fan of social network analysis, so am I. We've both deigned to use social network analysis to address our research questions. And I would say that I'll say it once more, that it's fine to be methods driven, so long as the research methods you're using substantively help you answer the research questions that you've set. In this case, the project is all about covert networks of suffragettes, that the network analysis approach just makes perfect intuitive sense. Having said about being methods driven being okay, the interview did raise some questions for me about whether in some ways Nick was perhaps being a slave to the methods rather than using the methods as his slave. Let me try to explain what I mean. So there are several network measures used, including the clustering coefficient, which measures the extent to which there are dense clusters within a network. So here there would be identified to be two fairly dense clusters. A second measure that he uses is this thing called the transitivity coefficient, which measures the extent to which every possible triad is or isn't connected. So here it would identify 3 potential triads, as well as an example of several nodes that aren't connected fully into a triad as well. It's easy to see how the clustering coefficient is addressing his hypotheses, which is the idea that networks would have dense localized clusters once the objective of the suffragettes was no longer about getting arrested, because they were trying to do their action covertly, therefore they would stick within a very small network of people active in that. It's less easy to see the additional value that the transitivity coefficient brings to trying to address that hypothesis. A third lesson that we can learn from the interview with Nick Crossley, and something that he openly admits himself, is that the affiliation data you get from people sharing participation, in his case in a court appearance, is only as useful as that event is meaningful of something. In this case, Crossley is trying to reconstruct covert networks of suffragettes on the basis of who it was who appeared in court at the same time as others. Of course, it's the case that perhaps some people were involved in that covert action but didn't get taken to court or didn't get arrested. There could be covert networks of suffragettes helping those who do illegal actions in very different ways, and his networks are unable to capture that dynamic. A final issue I'd like to draw your attention to in relation to the interview with Nick Crossley is about how to deal with time. So it's great to see that time is factored in here, But what this does not allow them to do is to pay much attention to autocorrelation, which is something that we take seriously in our interview with Will Jennings. There are social network methods developing that allow us to factor in time, and it's something that should be considered always when conducting a network analysis.